Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Katarzyna Szpargała. I am a PhD candidate at the Social Research and Cultural Studies Institute at the NYCU, and I will be a moderator for today's event. Thank you all for joining our event, Pursuing Digital Agency in the Era of Pervasive Surveillance and Disinformation. The event is a response to the recurring questions regarding people's digital agency and digital rights in the times of the increasing digitalization of the political, economic, and social environment that has enormous implications beyond digital technology. While the digitalization of daily life and private services simplify connecting with family and friends, accessing public and healthcare services, or engaging in activities, possibilities of misusing the digital technologies, for instance, by manipulating information, hate speech, or breaching privacy, became a major concern for people. That's why we decided to conduct this event. This event is also a part of the Chip Era and Digital Governance project, for which Professor Joyce Liu is principal investigator. And Professor, would you like to briefly introduce the main project for that?
Yeah, sure. Briefly, very briefly. Yeah. I want to remind the office that we should record the event, right? I don't think they are. It is.
I think it is already being recorded. Yes.
Thank you all for coming. As Kasia said, this research group on chip era and digital governance, we have been starting events since January this year. The keywords for our team is very familiar to every one of you, I think. Chip geopolitics, chip diplomacy, digital technology, tech war or chip war, or digital sovereignty, digital governance, and digital security, digital authoritarianism, digital surveillance, digital citizenship, biometric governance, and biopolitics change into algorithmic biopolitics, datafication of population, extraction of data, digital labor, and so on. So it's very pervasive in every corner of our societies. So since January this year, we have launched events. The first one was China, BRI, and the implication of digital governance, authoritarianism, and future of human rights. The second one is in March 18th, a critical reading of AI techno-ecology or ecological hybridity in Korean labor practices. And the third one is this one, Pursuing Digital Agency in the Era of Pervasive Surveillance and Disinformation. And all these are organized by our team and our research fellows. For example, the first one by Doma Zerling, the second one by Professor Yuvan Qiu. The third one, this one, today's event is organized by Kasia, Haina, and Lungani. Okay. And we will be two more upcoming events. I think you might also be interested. In May the 7th, Revisiting Digital Nationalism in China, Narrative, Technology, and Practice, organized by Dr. Zikai Liu, okay, in Zhengzhi University. And May the 19th, Chip Diplomacy is in its implication on reshaping India-Taiwan relations. It's organized by a team, Professor Mei-Ling Pan, and Punang Sharma, Monica Verma, and Doma Zerling. So we are very concerned of all this ongoing changes very rapidly. Only in 2 decades, it's already a different century. Of course, it's a different century, but the governmentality and everything, okay, labor production and geopolitical tension, multipolar competition or alliances or conflicts all rise up in this 2021st century, in the 3rd decade. That many of them will leading to different forms of war, direct physical war or hybrid war, cyber attack or another thing. So, but anyway, I'll give the mic back to Kasia. I thank you and your team for helping us to get this fantastic group of speakers. And we, of course, will try to record and also summarize the content into a digest form and circulate. Okay, so we want people to be more aware of our research and also how do we approach and think through these changes. So you are also welcome, every one of you, to join us for our future events online, most probably because you are at different places. And you are also welcome to propose or initiate, okay, other aspect that you are concerned with and you think we should work together. Okay, so I'll just stop here, and Kasia, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for introducing the project. Okay, and I think we can start with our presentations now. And today we have, unfortunately, only 2 speakers, as Tami Nakosi could not be with us today, so we will not be able to see his presentation. But we have Dr. Lungani Hlongwa, who graduated from our SRCS Institute and currently works as an independent researcher and is also a part of the China-Africa Research Initiative. And we have Dr. Aksa Farok from University of Amsterdam, where she is a postdoctoral researcher. And Dr. Farok is also a member of the European Digital Media Observatory project that monitors and combats disinformation. So like each of the speakers will have maybe now 35 to 40 minutes, as we have one presentation less. And after the presentation or the presentation, we will have the discussion and Q&A session. Also, like before we start, like this event is being recorded, as Professor Liu mentioned, and it might be later uploaded on the official ICCS website. So if anyone has any concerns regarding that, like please feel free to email us after the event. Okay, so if there are no questions, then please welcome our first speaker, Dr. Lungani Hlongwa, whose research interest focuses on China-Africa relations and Chinese influence on the region. So, like Lungani, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Kasia, for that kind introduction. I just don't know if my presentation will last 40 minutes, but I will try to, to package it within like the time frame that we originally discussed. Okay, so I'm going to try to share my presentation now. Okay, can everyone see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, only my slides, right? Not the notes, right? Just want to make sure.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. All right, so thank you again, Kasia. Today I'll be talking about the topic of Hick visionary urbanism and the patenting of social control. And as already mentioned, this is part of sub-project 2 of the Chip Era in Digital Governance project by the ICCS. And I would just like to start with some context. So over the past 2 decades or so, Chinese companies have been actively building digital infrastructure in Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, and pretty much everywhere around the world, focusing primarily on the global South. And this has increased since the introduction of what the Chinese government calls the Digital Silk Road Initiative, which focuses on constructing a range of digital infrastructure, including optic fiber cables, 5G networks, data centers, and smart cities. And what we see on this map is what could briefly be considered a map of the digital Silk Road. There is no official map, so research institutes out there have been trying to map like the activities of Chinese companies abroad, and this is just one example of those maps. And so my focus is on smart cities, or what Chinese technology companies call safe cities. Basically, these are smart cities in the making, as they focus on equipping city governments with urban surveillance technologies that enable them to better monitor the city. And this is all done in the name of fighting crime and making cities safer. And in my research, I refer to this industry as the big chem industry, taken obviously from the term big tech. And it's important to note, of course, that it's not only Chinese companies that are active in this industry. There are a lot of companies, for example, from the US that are supplying surveillance technologies to African countries, and also companies from Europe, from Israel. So it's not just purely a Chinese project. And so my research focuses then on Southern Africa. And I try to use Johannesburg as a case study. Johannesburg is a city in South Africa, but I try to position it within the broader context of Southern Africa. And I found that in Zimbabwe, several companies are operating there, including CloudWalk, Huawei, and Hikvision. And CloudWalk is quite an interesting case because they basically made a deal with the Zimbabwean government to extract data from the general public of Zimbabwe. And that data was then sent back to China, and it was used to train facial recognition algorithms to better recognize people with darker skin tones, because oftentimes you find that these technologies don't have the capacity to do so accurately. So this was quite a very interesting case. And then also Huawei is operating there, Hikvision. In Botswana, we have Huawei as well that's operating there, building what they call safe cities. In Zambia, we have Huawei, ZTE, Dahua, which is a partially state-owned company. Hikvision is a completely state-owned company. And then in Mauritius, we have Huawei. And I'm sure there's more, but these are the major companies that are operating in these countries. And of course, these are not the only countries that are seeing these kind of technologies, but these are the ones that I could find online based on my research. And these technologies are having major socio-political implications. For example, there are issues regarding the legality of the infrastructure that's being constructed. Some activists are questioning whether these technologies are actually following established frameworks within those particular cities and those particular countries, because oftentimes you find that companies will install the infrastructure without really going through the entire process of gaining civic participation and getting the views of the people that are affected by them. And then, of course, there's also the issue of abuse. There are certain instances where local governments abuse the technologies to monitor activists, to monitor the public and minorities. And there are obviously privacy and ethical concerns, and technological accuracy, as I mentioned. Sometimes they don't work very well when it comes to people with darker skin tones, because oftentimes these technologies are trained using a database that is not from Africa. So then their capabilities is limited in that sense. And then, of course, they impact urban governance, and they promote social inequality. And there are also geopolitical implications as well. For example, they expand China's strategic interest in Africa, and they also enhance China's soft power. and also enhance its data access, which is, as we understand it, the digital economy, data is a strategic resource. So by gaining access to this data, China is better able to train its algorithms. And obviously, this is part of the broader war on AI and facial recognition and other technologies related to that. And then, of course, they promote Chinese technology standards, and they force a dependency upon Chinese technology providers. And then, of course, they feed into the US-China geopolitical rivalry, making these countries a new geopolitical battleground. So then in my research in Johannesburg, I conducted several site visits there, and I took pictures of some of the cameras that I installed there. And I discovered that there are definitely some pull factors from the city itself that's drawing these technologies there, or these companies there. The city has its own developmental strategy. They aim to make Johannesburg into a smart city. And so, yeah, these cities have bought into this idea of using surveillance to clamp down on crime and to make urban spaces safer. And then, of course, there are also local entrepreneurs as well that are working with these transnational companies like Hikvision. For example, in Johannesburg, we have a company called Vumacam, and the supplier of Vumacam's cameras is Hikvision. In fact, they manufacture cameras specifically for the South African context, whatever that means. It was very interesting to read up about like how Hikvision manufactures cameras for this particular company that is specifically targeted at the South African market. And then, of course, there are push factors as well. One of them is what is called donation diplomacy, where a company would approach the city government and they'll tell them that so we have these technologies and you're welcome to come to China and observe for yourself how they work. In fact, over the last few years, like a lot of African city governments have been invited on trips, fully paid and fully funded, to China to observe how safe city technologies work. And there was one example in South Africa where while the city governments were in China observing how they work, a tender was issued in South Africa for these technologies to be installed. But then opposition parties quickly came onto this and they questioned this whole process. So yeah, then I would like to delve a little bit deeper on some of the specifications of these cameras. Some of them have facial recognition, which, as I mentioned, is still a technology that is in the developmental stage. But oftentimes, when it's marketed, it's not mentioned that it's not working accurately. I don't even think that the governments actually understand what they are acquiring. This is what I gathered from the people that I interviewed during my studies, that like the government doesn't really understand how these technologies work, the risks that they bring, and other issues as well, such as racial profiling. And there are also fears as well that they might suppress those with dissenting views, for example, activists and protesters who disagree or who criticize the government. There are fears that these technologies might be used to clamp down on those people. So moving on now then to this concept of visionary urbanism. So what I understand as visionary urbanism refers to Hikvision, not only Hikvision, of course, but other tech companies' role in transforming Johannesburg into an urban panopticon. And of course, this concept of urban panopticon is inspired by Foucault's concept of the panopticon, where there's a watcher, and then those who are watched are forced to modify their behaviors according to how they expect the watcher to, or basically according to the standards of the watcher. So a city structured around constant surveillance, where residents modify their behaviors because they know they're being watched. And it highlights how surveillance technologies reshape urban life, governance, and socio-political realities. And then, so now I'd like to move on to the next phase of the presentation where I talk about the patterns. This is one of my the methods that I use in my study. So I looked at patterns from two perspectives. The first one from an epistemological perspective. So here I look at patterns as not just legal documents or business technology documents, but patents as social artifacts, meaning that they are viewed as documents that embed ideological and philosophical visions, not just technological innovations. Because oftentimes when a company files for a patent, that means they have a clear vision of how they want the technology to work in society. So basically, my understanding of patents is not only as technological documents, but documents that have corporate imaginaries embedded in them. And then also, of course, from a socio-political lens as well, patents reveal how inventors imagine and seek to shape human behavior and social order. And they also bridge the divide between the global and the local. They show how global technological strategies manifest in local contexts like Johannesburg. And then in terms of the methodology, I developed what I call critical patent analysis, where I employ both quantitative and qualitative analysis of patents. So I would look at the broader trends. Is the patenting activity increasing or is it decreasing? And what specific patents are being filed in numbers? So if we look here, for example, we see that Hikvision has been rapidly increasing its patents since 2014. So if you look at 2023, for example, we see they filed over 1,200 patents. And if you look at 2024, it seems like it's a decline, but it's not an actual decline. It's only because of the delay in patent publications. So that usually takes about a year or two. So that's why you see that declining trend. So then what I discovered is that Hikvision is a leader in both conventional and experimental spaces. Conventional means like your everyday cameras that you find everywhere in your shopping malls, businesses. And then the experimental space is where they're experimenting with other more cutting edge stuff like emotion recognition and like trying to predict if a person's going to commit a crime maybe in the next 2 days or something. That's what the experimental phase means. And so Hikvision leads in both these spaces. And then they're also a global leader in facial recognition patents. And it also emerged to me that they're monopolizing facial recognition technology standards at the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, which is basically a global standard setting body under the United Nations. So what this means basically is that these companies will gain a greater influence in terms of setting the technology standards for surveillance technologies, not only in China, but also globally, because the ITU is a global organization. So that means then that they will gain a greater influence in the global south, because many countries in the don't really have the capacity to set their own technology standards. They tend to be technology standard takers instead of setters. Okay, so now I would like to move on to like specific patents that I uncovered during my research. And the first patent is a method and device and equipment for determining the correlation degree between personnel and an event. So this technology basically attempts to link individuals or people to a specific, or by matching their behavior, history, and an event detail. So they use historical data, for example, case logs, public info, to calculate an association degree. And it aims to improve the investigation of theft, fraud, crowd behavior, where cameras alone can fail, and can also be used for tracking and public event analysis. So what's interesting to me when it comes to this patent is that they can correlate a person to a particular event. Now, the word event is quite vague. It could be a shopping event, but it could also be a protest. We see this, for example, in 2022 during the COVID-19 pandemic. The Chinese government was able to crack down on protesters. It's by virtue of these technologies that they were able to go to people's homes and pick them up from their homes, because they have this, they have access to these technologies that are able to link an individual to a particular event. And then, of course, it's applied in controversial cases as well. There's an example where Hikvision was awarded a project to build what it calls a smart campus, which monitors students' dining records. See, for example, if you go to the dining hall and whether you go there to eat, and then they're able to use this data to see which students are participating in Ramadan. This is a very interesting case of how they can associate an individual to a particular event. Of course, we know that the issue of the Muslim Uyghurs in China as well is also implicated in this whole story. And then it also raises major concerns about privacy, freedom, and speech and religious rights. And Hikvision's accountability was questioned after admitting, but not providing project cancellation. So when Hikvision was actually questioned about this project of a smart campus, they simply said, okay, so the project has been cancelled, but they never really provided evidence that the smart campus of tracking students' dining records was cancelled. And then moving on to the second patent. So this one is titled Recognition Method, Device and Equipment and System. And what this patent attempts to do is to detect emotional states of not just individuals, but groups of people. So it gathers data from facial expressions, body language, and vocal tones, and it analyzes and maps group emotions. For example, red for negative, green for positive moods. And it aims to enhance public safety by enabling authorities to intervene based on detected emotions. So in short, this patent basically tries to determine how a group of people gathered in a public space feel. This is a very dystopian technology. It uses maps to say, okay, so this group feels happy or this group feels angry, and we should therefore deploy measures to intervene to address this emotional state. In fact, the people, company that filed, so Hikvision, that filed this patent, they're very explicit about the kinds of emotions that they intend to clamp down on. And then the issues that this kind of invention raises is that it's based on scientifically flawed assumptions. That is, for example, facial expressions are unreliable indicators of emotions. We know that what we show on our faces is not always how we feel. But if you look at this patent, it's based on exactly on that logic that our facial expressions reveal our inner feelings, but that's not always the case. And then it's also, it's based on what is called junk science, basically. And it also raises ethical concerns. It enables biased surveillance and discrimination in policing and public life, and technology linked to human rights abuses, as I mentioned, the Xinjiang case, and planned integration into smart cities. And then the third patent that I'll talk about, this is the last one, is one titled Intelligent Establishment Method for Asian Face Database. This was also a very interesting patent for me because it prompted me to ask questions beyond what was just being patented. So this particular patent builds a facial recognition database specifically for Asian faces. This is according to the inventors. So it sources images from Asian movies to address lack of Asian data in public databases. It uses face detection, clustering, and labeling algorithms to create a usable database. And it aims to improve model performance and reduce costs compared to traditional data collection. So so in summary, this patent basically, the inventors, they recognize that oftentimes databases are not equally representative. So for example, you might find that certain ethnic or racial groups are not fully in the databases that they use to train the algorithms. So then to circumvent that challenge, they use Asian movies to capture people's faces. And then they use those captured images to train facial recognition algorithms to better identify people of Asian ethnicity. And so that caused me to wonder whether such technologies exist in the African urban spaces as well. Because oftentimes we just see cameras popping up, but we don't really understand how they work, which company installed them, and where the data goes that's captured by those cameras. They actually note that the inventors of this particular patent acknowledge the lack of of African representation as well in the databases that they use, and so they recognize that need to capture data that is context specific, that is location specific, and then using that data to train cameras to better identify people. And the concerns that this particular patent raises, obviously data and privacy consent. Individuals are unaware of the data that's being collected. They don't know who's collecting it and where it's going. It also highlights potential to create databases for other ethnic groups without ethical safeguards. Technology may reinforce racial bias and automated racism in surveillance systems. There's also the risk of global misuse. So, for example, these technologies could be exported to countries where surveillance could target minority populations. So then, having looked at all these patents, I concluded that what these companies are essentially patenting is patenting tools for social control. They're turning surveillance into property. So these patents protect technologies that monitor, predict, and control public behavior for profit. They expand what counts as patentable, similar to social media's commodification of interaction. So I did another study a few years back looking at how Facebook does something similar, but not in the space of urban surveillance, but in terms of how they commodify our social interactions. And then they normalize social control by serving as tools that help embed urban monitoring as a standard feature of city life, what is called data cities. And it supports what is known as techno-authoritarianism, where you have fewer watchers and more efficient mass surveillance. And then there's, of course, the issue of human rights and inequalities. It enables racial profiling. In the case of Johannesburg, for example, which is still a very racially divided city, where you find that certain groups of people are more at risk of being surveilled on than others. In fact, if Tami was here, I was going to share a bit more on that because he has like some personal experiences with these technologies. And there's also the risk of privacy abuses and the suppression of dissent, as I earlier mentioned. And then corporate claims of respecting rights, often seen as superficial reputation management. So then I'm coming to the last part of my presentation now, where I would like to talk about this concept of digital agency, which our topic is based on. So what is digital agency then? So digital agency is the capacity of actors, whether they be governments, institutions, or civil society, to negotiate, influence, and shape their digital futures. It focuses on the control of digital space and data sovereignty. It seeks to flatten regional hierarchies, allowing even local actors to influence global digital structures. It aims to counter patterns of digital colonialism by promoting inclusive governance of the digital realm. And in terms of specifics, in terms of how to pursue digital agency, we could, in Africa, in the African context, we could consider diversifying technology partners to avoid dependence on a single country or a single company. We should also negotiate equitable partnerships that ensure technology transfer and local capacity building. We should strengthen data protection laws to safeguard privacy and prevent exploitation. We should also leverage regional frameworks like the AU's Convention on Cybersecurity and Personal Data Protection. So these are just some of the steps that I thought African countries can take in terms of pursuing digital agency, which is, as I mentioned, it's about the capacity for different actors, whether they be governments, institutions, civil societies, or even individuals to participate and to negotiate what happens to their digital selves, whether that is data and their digital identities. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you. However, I would like to share some voice notes from the participants that I interviewed in my study. So Kasha, please tell me if you can hear. Can you hear my Can you hear the voice clips?
No,
You cannot?
not.
Okay, let me just try. Okay, how about now?
If I have one regret.
Can you hear it now?
Yes.
Okay, so this was an interview that I conducted with a technology expert from IPVM who shared his perspectives on how patents can highlight some of these issues.
During my time at IPVM. If I have one regret during my time at IPVM, it's that I didn't spend more time looking at patents. I think patent databases are a really promising avenue to understand the social implications of technology, to understand what technology is being built, particularly when it comes to Chinese companies, because the directive many years ago to Chinese technology companies was basically file as many patents as you can. Because China wanted to lead the world in how many patents they have. And the unintentional result of that for China is that they patented a lot of things they probably didn't want people to see. And you, maybe the reason you're interested in this, I don't know, but you may be familiar with the Uyghur recognition system that we found patents for. There are others in the patent database like that. And I mean, Hikvision, I don't remember the exact number, but there were hundreds at least, hundreds of patents for Hikvision.
Okay, and then he also spoke about what is called techno-authoritarianism.
I think that Hikvision has the potential to be one of China's big exporters of what people call techno-authoritarianism. What keeps me up at night, my biggest concern when it comes to the surveillance industry, is that these mass surveillance systems they're building in China will be exported. And so for a country like Iran, for instance, you know, those protests that happened a year or two back, they started because of a woman who was killed by the police there. You may remember what I'm talking about. There were mass protests in Iran. If they had this kind of technology in place, I'm not sure that those protests could have happened. And so I think the fundamental impact of this is that we're going to see more stable authoritarian governments. You know, an assumption of the democratic world and of United States foreign policy is that authoritarianism is inherently unstable, and that over time countries will convert to democracies. My concern is that Hikvision and other countries like it may have found a technological solution to that instability, effectively automating the large public security forces that would be needed to control large populations with a very small group of people, the leadership.
Okay, and then just one last voice clip on racial profiling. This was also from one of the participants in my interviews.
People are going to get wrongfully arrested and sorts of things. It's going to be a mess because the algorithms there are bad. They can't make out a black face. They can't separate black faces. Blacks are all the same for these cameras. And the other problem for me is this is the digital dumbbells. Previously, our mothers had to carry passes to go through a particular area. No bus, I have permission from my bus to go there. Now, when you go into a area like Sentin, you're told you are loitered. And then private security tells you, no, you're not welcome here, you must leave. That in itself is a digital ID. It's the same system. It's the same apartheid system being reincarnated in a different way using artificial intelligence. We're not carrying physical passes anymore, but we're carrying. Somebody is watching. Big Brother is looking at us, and we must verify who we are in our own country, in our own spaces. And then the worst thing that happens then is ultimately that people get abused by private security primarily because middle class South Africans and elite South Africans have gated the suburbs in the north. That's even worse. Now they've gated the suburbs to deny people access to public spaces, and then after that they put security companies in there, and after that they put cameras in there. So it's a triple jeopardy for and unfortunately for me, it really is racial profiling. I've never seen a white person being stopped in that way. I myself have been stopped for a couple of times. I deliberately went to places like Bosanigin and walked around just because I wanted to test the system. I got stopped. I got asked questions, and I was threatened to be beaten up.
So I just wanted to share those clips as they encapsulate some of the points that I was talking about. That would be the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ngani, for your presentation. It was very informative because I think we are observing the increase of smart cities or safe cities, right, all around the world. And it is mostly promoted to keep the streets safe. But there are other issues that are quite concerning, relate to that, as you mentioned, right? Facial recognition, data privacy, racial bias, that not all people know about this. This is not really promoted or that available to people. And people have a right to factual information, right, on how those technologies work. Right? So now, if we are at the information or the right to information, I think we can invite Dr. Aksa to share her presentation with Dr. Farooq research interests focus on the generative AI and misinformation and disinformation among citizens and young people experience with those issues. Connect.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Greetings from Amsterdam, where it's currently morning. Can you see my slide fine?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, great. So thank you so much for inviting me to be here as well, to share my research and to be part of this very interesting event. So based on what we just heard, amazing presentation, what I'm going to be talking about is more of the citizen perspective of this threat of information, and in relation specifically to a very, very important democratic process, namely in relation to elections. And also moving from the global south to the global north here in terms of the focus of my presentation as well. So I would like to start by taking you all back to around the start of last year. And you would have noticed there were a lot of news articles and headlines that had this type of theme around them. They were emphasizing the threat of AI-generated disinformation and misinformation, and overall the influence of AI-enabled technology, and in relation to something very specific that was going to happen last year, which was that a huge number of countries around the world were going to be having their elections. So more than 50 countries had their elections last year in 2024. And at the start of the year, this mass election event was touted as the big election year. And there was always this undertone of the potential role that AI could play in relation to the elections in terms of the access to accurate information that citizens may or may not be able to have. And as you can see from these headlines, this threat was almost overemphasized. So the language is very, it's very almost threatening. It's saying that AI has voted. It's saying, how worried should you be about AI disrupting elections? There's this certainty to the fact that AI is almost certainly going to have an impact on the elections. And this didn't just come out of anywhere. So here I'm now citing the World Economic Forum's Global Risks Perception Survey. Every year they gather experts from around the world and ask them to discuss some of the major questions and social issues facing society. And one of the questions that they were asked, which they are asked every year, is about risks. So they were asked about global risks and how severe they believe the impact of these risks to be over a short-term and long-term period. Short-term being over the next 2 years and long-term being over a 10-year period. And over the last few years, we have seen that misinformation and disinformation tend to come up on top as one of those perceived very, very prevalent threats that face society. And for me, when I look at this list, I'm seeing things like weather events and climate catastrophe and inequality. And to see misinformation and disinformation ranking higher than those things, it's quite stark. It really does make you think, okay, well, this issue is clearly gathering a lot of attention. And as a researcher in this field for quite some time, this used to be a topic that was growing around political circles, but now it seems to be getting global attention. And just to be on the same page about what exactly is misinformation and disinformation. So misinformation and disinformation are the same in the sense that it's about the information that tends to have the appearance or is tend to circulate it as if it is accurate information, as if it is evidence-based, but it is not. What differentiates misinformation and disinformation is the intent behind it. So misinformation can be unintentional, it can be accidental. So it could be your grandma forwarding something on WhatsApp, thinking that it's going to be very, very helpful information for people in her network, but it's actually false information. And you know that she means well, she doesn't have devious intentions. And it can also just be inaccurate information spread where there's ambiguous intention. So we don't always know whether someone means to deceive their audience or not. However, with disinformation, there is a very specific intentionality component that is usually quite clear. So disinformation is deliberately fabricated information of all kinds that is spread with this intention to mislead people. There's also a third type of information threat, let's say, which is malinformation. Malinformation is similar to disinformation in the sense that there's an intention to harm, but malinformation is accurate information. So that would involve deliberately leaking private information about a person or about a company. And even though the information itself is accurate, the intentionality is usually something quite malicious, and there is an intention to harm someone or a group of people. And so these are the types of information chaos that have been garnering a lot of attention, particularly around election time. And you will see that these types of terms really do get thrown around a lot and talked about a lot in terms of the implications that they might have on democratic processes. And that is because elections hinge on the public, citizens, the voters having access to and being able to engage with accurate information. And these threats do present as a potential block in terms of people being able to access accurate information. And of course, there's many reasons why someone might share disinformation and misinformation. That's not the focus of this talk. However, it is important to think about the fact that there are people for whom the outcome of this type of behavior, so whether it's spreading misinformation or disinformation or malinformation, it can be financial, it can be political, but in today's world of social media, where you get engagement and engagement metrics can lead to financial gains and other types of gain, sometimes it can be about just trying to create trouble and chaos and reap the rewards of that, whether it's financial or whether it's psychological even. So moving on to the specific focus of this talk is, of course, about the role of artificial intelligence, and in particular generative AI, in terms of exacerbating the threat of disinformation. So we've all seen that over the last few years, particularly in the advent of OpenAI launching its ChatGPT large language model, we've seen this influx of various types of sophisticated AI systems. And in particular, these large generative AI models, they are particularly outstanding and shocking and exciting for various different reasons, but specifically because of their accessibility. So it's very, very easy for us as citizens to go create an account and use these services, which is unprecedented. It was perhaps AI and artificial intelligence were perhaps a lot more out of scope for the average citizen, not today. But these models also stand out for their ability to be able to produce misleading content. And that's where the threat of disinformation becomes all the more apparent. And we've seen this. We've seen this over the last few years. We've seen that AI-generated content has indeed been used to propagate even political disinformation campaigns, and indeed to incite hostile narratives about vulnerable groups. And what makes this interesting is that, of course, disinformation and false information about political parties or opponents or about specific groups is not old. It's been happening for as long as we've had the ability to pick up a newspaper and read what's going on in the world. However, what makes this particular period of information chaos so interesting and so worrying as well at the same time is because of the speed at which AI can allow even the average citizen to be able to create content that can go viral and can cause huge amounts of disruption. And of course, it's not just the citizens who have been using this technology to create content that goes viral, that is not always accurate. It's also authority figures who have circulated such content. So that includes political authority figures and people who are in contention for seats at an election. In this image on the presentation screen, you can see an example of a very, very disruptive form of disinformation being used to target specific vulnerable groups. So on the left is an image of Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and on the right is Prince William. And their image was circulated across various different meta platforms like Facebook and Instagram. And it was usually, their image was used to advertise a cryptocurrency scam. And in that scam, people would be told that they would get lots of money if they just put their information and their details on the website. And when they did, they were scammed out of a lot of money. And this type of ad reached almost 1 million people. So this, for particularly vulnerable groups, for people who aren't familiar with the technology and the telltale signs of when something is AI generated, when something is a deep fake and a video, or when it's not, for those particular groups, this type of threat can be particularly disconcerting and can cause a lot of both financial and psychological distress. So here we're using the term disinformation, you might have noticed, and that is because in order to go onto a generative AI platform and to create content using these services that's then circulated with the specific purpose of misleading people, that constitutes as spreading disinformation, which is why I use the term disinformation when talking about these AI-generated threats. Focusing now specifically on the elections and the fact that last year was a very, very big year for democracy because of the sheer number of countries that were participating in election events across the globe. And of course, with this huge number of elections, there is also this huge upsurge in concern of the potential role that AI could play. And over the last few years, indeed, even before 2024, we saw a huge number of incidents of AI-generated disinformation in the form of images, but also in the form of audio and text, which were featuring in the political landscapes across the world. And here I have some examples of a case, a deep fake of a political opponent created by the a Polish opposition party. We also had an example where a politician in Pakistan was in jail, and yet the AI was used to bring his speech to the voters, to the citizens, to his supporters, ahead of the Pakistani general elections, despite the fact that he wasn't really there to do that speech. And so this indicates just the role that AI was playing across the world. Focusing specifically here now on Europe, which is where I conducted this research, there was this huge, of course, attention to this topic. And perhaps as a result of that, there was also a lot of concern expressed by citizens. So a sample of citizens in Germany were surveyed and asked about how they felt about the upcoming elections and the threat of AI, and 71% of those surveyed said that they were concerned. And of course, this wasn't just a concern that was represented by the media and journalists and by politicians or citizens. It was indeed taken seriously. There was a lot of EU legislation that was put in place to try and protect citizens and make sure that tech companies were limiting the role that they were playing in spreading this type of content on their platforms. And indeed, in something that I think is pretty unlikely, the tech platforms really did mobilize to respond to these concerns, but also the fact that there are countries like the EU, there were bodies like the EU and then countries like the United States of America and the United Kingdom, all of which having elections last year, were very, very much concerned about the potential role of tech platforms in terms of allowing for this type of threat to flourish on their platforms. And in response, Google, Meta, TikTok, they all did mobilize to launch specific counter strategies. So in relation to the EU elections that took place last year, Google, Meta, and TikTok did indeed launch specific EU election counter strategies to prepare citizens and voters ahead of the EU elections. So that is exactly where the context of the research that I'm going to be talking about today. So last year were the European elections, and these elections are quite interesting because they're not they don't receive the same amount of attention by voters, but also outside of that by the media, by the world, as a national election does or a presidential election does. But they are equally important in the sense that who you vote for at these European elections will be the person that represents you at the EU level. And so last year, the European elections were held, and the campaigns were very much revolving around the same type of language of threat, of be very, very fearful. So in this particular poster, which was everywhere, if you were living or visiting any EU country, use your vote or others will decide for you, is again a very ominous kind of foreshadowing of this potential threat, potential role of an other that could be voting on your behalf. And that is, of course, a very, very deliberate way of telling you to be very, very careful about how you cast your vote and the role that each individual plays in this ecosystem when there is this very prevalent threat of people who wish to be deceptive, who wish to use technologies to mislead people, for instance. And so in and around this huge pervasive campaign all across the world, because it wasn't just an EU election year, it was a year of elections across many, many countries around the world. There was a lot of attention to this threat of AI-generated disinformation and the fact that it could disrupt our elections. And here I cite the work of my colleagues at the European Digital Media Observatory. What they were doing is they were tracking every single month in the year leading up to the elections. They were tracking the amount of disinformation that was being spread in relation specifically to the EU elections. And within each monthly brief that they were publishing, so as you can see below, on the x-axis, each month represents each monthly brief that they were publishing with a report of the disinformation stories that they had to fact check. What you can see here on the graph is a representation of the proportionate amount of stories from each monthly fact-checking brief that consisted of AI-generated disinformation. And it never exceeded 5%. So there were never more of the total articles that they were fact-checking, there were never more than 5% that were about AI-generated disinformation. And 5% is a very low number considering the huge amount of threat and speculation and attention given to this role of AI. And so that got me and a couple of other colleagues at the University of Amsterdam thinking about, okay, so what exactly is this threat of AI? Is it really affecting citizens? How much are they believing that they are coming across? And is it really influencing their ability to participate in this key democratic process? And so what we did is we had a sample of citizens in 3 pretty different EU nation states. So we had citizens from the Netherlands, Germany, and Poland. And what we did is we surveyed them over the course of the election. So we first launched a survey with these citizens before the election, about a month before the election. And then we did a second survey with them directly before the election. So some of them would have done the survey like the day before voting would have opened in their country. And then the final survey was launched directly after the election to kind of see how their feelings changed over time. And what we found was indeed there was this huge amount of concern about the threat of generative AI in the upcoming elections. So what you can see that really, really stands out, first of all, is that citizens in the Netherlands were most concerned about the threat of generative AI in the upcoming elections. And what you can also see from the different colored bars is that citizens were most concerned across most countries overall, if you look at the means, in the wave right before the elections. So right in that week, as they were about to get ready to decide who to cast their vote for, that's when people were most concerned about the threat of generative AI in the upcoming elections. Oh, I don't know what just happened. Sorry about that. Went all the way to the end. All right, we're back. So that was in terms of concerns, right? But then we were wondering, okay, well, to what extent do concerns even align with encounters? So how much are people encountering this content? And this is where things get very interesting, because as you can see from the very, very first measure of our scale, which is never, majority of our citizens, so the orange bar, at the start of this survey, at the start of this research, so in the first wave, were claiming that they weren't even seeing anything. So almost 50% in each country of our sample were saying that they weren't seeing anything at all. And following that, it was less than monthly. So they're not really encountering that much content produced by generative AI. But I should caveat this by saying that this is entirely citizens' perspectives. This is not actual data of how much they actually encountered. This is citizens' own perceptions of what they're encountering, which is arguably more important, because what they think they're encountering will affect their behavior. But what is really interesting here is that at the beginning of this data collection process, almost half of our participants across the board were saying that they didn't see anything at all. This then did, of course, decline in the second wave and in the third wave, where participants were saying that they were seeing content much more. And again, what really stands out on a country level is the fact that in Poland, where, remember, from the last question, you can see that Polish people were actually the least concerned. People in Poland were actually encountering the most generative AI content in relation to the European elections. So that's very, very interesting. So even though they were encountering the most content, they were the least concerned. But of course, we're interested in disinformation here. So people might have seen AI-generated content, but they didn't really think that it was out to deceive them, right? It could just be an AI-generated campaign poster that's not really trying to deceive them. But what we were really interested in was, because of this huge amount of attention given to the spread of disinformation generated by AI, we wanted to know how much of the content that they thought was AI generated about the elections was trying to deliberately deceive them. And what's interesting is, again, we find this in this role of timing. So right before the election, so the green bar in the middle, wave 2, is when people were seeing the most AI-generated disinformation. Again, Poland stands out because they're claiming to see the most of this type of content. And there's a number of explanations for that, right? The relative proximity of Poland to Russia could be one reason, and the fact that they're more likely to come across disinformation campaigns. We also had that very specific example of the Polish Prime Minister in 2023 being involved in a deep fake created by the opposition party. So there are some reasons to believe that Poland could be more subjected to this type of content. But it is interesting to note that the Netherlands, the citizens in the Netherlands were not seeing that much content, and yet they were the most concerned. And then the last few questions we asked them were focused directly on their perceptions of how fair the elections would be in light of this threat, right? In light of this threat of AI-generated disinformation. And what we see is that in the Netherlands and Germany is a very, very similar pattern, where initially, before the elections, they were quite worried about whether the elections will be held in a fair way. But when it came around to post-election, so the maroon bar, wave 3, you can see that they're kind of there's quite a big increase where eventually they can admit that indeed the elections were held in a fair way. However, in Poland, you are seeing a very, very different trend. So at the start of the election campaign, citizens were a lot more hopeful about how fair the elections would be compared to post-election, where they thought that the elections were not held in such a fair way. However, as you can see, overall, the mean is very much near the midpoint of the scale. So we're not talking about people feeling very, very much like their elections were completely unfair and undemocratic. And then at the end, we also asked them about how satisfied they were with the way democracy works in the European Union. And again, very similar patterns in the Netherlands and Germany. But this time in Poland, also very similar. No significant differences here in terms of the different countries. And overall, not much change across the waves. So when it came to the overall process of the European Union, people were, this threat or the potential role of the threat of generative AI was not really a big factor here. However, in their own countries, perhaps there's differences. Because as you can see in this question, we're asking about the elections in their own country, whereas here, it's about their satisfaction with democracy across the European Union. So that was one half of this research that we conducted last year with citizens across the Netherlands and Germany and Poland. But what I was also interested in was the fact that, well, I know from my research and everything that I've observed in this topic of misinformation and disinformation is that misinformation and disinformation is not just spread without some sort of motive. There's usually some sort of message, some sort of ideology that is portrayed within the content that is circulated. And that brought me on to thinking about some of the major issues that were the points of discussion at this European Union election in particular. So one of the biggest topics that people talk about in relation to elections and who to vote for is climate change. And another topic is mass immigration. So these topics get a lot of attention around election time, especially in the EU. And what I saw was a lot of political parties using generative AI to create these types of images. So on the left is an image that actually I created myself, which is supposed to portray the city center of Amsterdam completely flooded due to climate change. And on the right is an image that actually was inspired specifically from the German far-right party AfD's political campaign to make their supporters feel very, very threatened by the role of immigration. And they used an image that was trying to portray brown-looking immigrants in this very aggressive and violent manner to try and raise awareness about the negative consequences of mass immigration. And so I used their image to create this image, which is of a similar vein of trying to portray people looking very, very aggressive from a certain part of the world in order to portray this image that immigration is very, very bad. And what I did was I asked the same participants in the Netherlands, Germany, and Poland about when they thought it was okay for politicians to use generative AI to create these types of images. And of course, I wanted to know whether their own feelings about these issues would have an influence. So if you think that climate change is very, very important, are you okay with a political party, for instance, the Green Party in your country, creating an image like this of Amsterdam completely flooded which is not true. I can confirm by looking outside, right? It's disinformation because it's portraying something inaccurate. It might be saying that this is the future, this is what's going to happen in 30, 40 years. But that is arguably what the people on the right are also doing, right? They're also arguing that if we don't control our borders, there will be images like this everywhere. And so again, the question was to the citizens, to the people who did this survey, was how okay or not okay would you be with the use of generative AI to create these types of images, depending on where you stand on these issues. And what we found was indeed there was this role of issue position. So where participants themselves placed themselves in terms of where they felt about how they felt about these issues of climate change and immigration, and their acceptance of generative AI being used by politicians. So the graphs are not very nice to follow, I apologize. But just to give you a very quick summary of what we're seeing here is that if participants believed that climate change was an important topic, they were more likely to accept the use of generative AI by a politician to create an image, for instance, of a city center flooded. On the other hand, if participants thought that mass immigration was an important issue, then they were indeed also very happy and accepting for the use of generative AI by politicians to create images like the one that I just showed you. And here is the actual example. So this is what inspired me to do that study, was because on the left, you can see that this is indeed an image used by the German far-right party to stoke fear and hatred about mass immigration and its consequences, specifically for the German native citizens. And on the right is an image that is supposed to be summarize and to conclude and wrap up all of this research. What we found was that indeed citizens from Germany and the Netherlands were most concerned, Netherlands in particular, however, were very, very concerned with this threat, generative AI, but it was in fact citizens in Poland who were encountering the most disinformation. Overall, we did see that over the course of the election, people were reporting more and more encounters with generative AI disinformation. Could this be an effect of participating in the study? Possibly, so perhaps more research is needed here. But what we did find that was really interesting was that the period directly before the election was when participants were claiming to see the most AI-generated disinformation. And we also know that sometimes, and in particular in the Netherlands, people actually decide who they're going to vote for, sometimes directly the day before the election. And so if we're to assume that people are encountering the most AI-generated threats directly before the election, then perhaps this is something quite alarming. We found that Poland, citizens from Poland were the most concerned about electoral fairness. And that was because they also reported to seeing the most top-down disinformation. So I didn't actually include this finding in this presentation, but we found that citizens in Poland were claiming to have seen the most content produced by other politicians that was using generative AI to spread disinformation. So perhaps there's this relationship between how fair they think the elections in their country went and the amount of disinformation they saw that was produced by their own politicians. Another finding that I didn't present, but we also found, was that citizens mostly encountered AI-generated text and images. So despite the number of threats of potential deepfakes and video clips and audio, text and images were the most likely to be encountered. Text is very interesting because it's very unlikely to, it's even for someone like me who does a lot of research on this area, I find it very hard to know when text is generated by AI, but it's also very difficult to detect it using the algorithms of social media platforms. So perhaps it goes undetected, and then citizens tend to figure out that there is AI-generated text circulating. Again, another thing for more research to delve into. And of course, as we saw at the end there, we did see that issue importance is crucial to acceptance of generative AI when it comes to false content. So I think this is a very, very important point. We're very, we care deeply about the threat of disinformation in relation to elections, as we should. But one important factor that we often overlook is that when politicians, for instance, use disinformation in their campaigns, it's very, very hard for citizens to find that as a point to disregard them for, if the disinformation, the content that they're presenting to their audience speaks to their values and to the issues that they care about. So if you really care about mass immigration and the potential threat that presents to you and your children and the future generations in your native country, then you will probably excuse a politician using generative AI to create an image that is very deceptive and very inaccurate and full of hatred and fear, if you think that issue is worth promoting and getting people to think about. We also have, of course, like I mentioned, there were elections across the globe, but some of the conclusions from the countries where there was this potential threat of AI really upending democracy is that, in fact, the number, so if you actually look at the viral cases of AI-generated disinformation and deepfakes, during cases such as in the EU and in France and in the UK, it's way, way, way lower than what people had feared. Overall, there's really no evidence, and I think my own research that I presented here supports the findings of the Alan Turing Institute in the UK, that basically concluded that there's really no evidence to suggest that AI-enabled disinformation had this meaningful impact on the results of the elections in the UK or in the EU. Most exposure was concentrated amongst a very small minority of users whose beliefs are already aligned to ideological narratives. And I think, again, the research I presented is very much congruent with this report. However, the things that perhaps we should be concerned about when it comes to AI and the damaging role that it plays in democracy is that there was a lot of content online that was about inciting hatred against political figures, which is very threatening to their personal safety and can be very discouraging for, let's say, an up-and-coming politician who might rethink whether they want to be involved in politics when it's so easy to create false images of them and false representations of them to stoke hatred, to stoke partisan hatred. The other issue that has been raised by this huge threat of AI-generated disinformation is that it creates a lot of confusion, a lot of concern, and it damages trust. So people don't know what to believe anymore. They know that seeing is no longer believing. They can't trust what they see online. This also erodes their trust in online sources because even political and authority figures share and circulate AI-generated false content. And that can be very, very problematic when they do so without using clear labels. And a lot of policy and discussions around legislation has been moving towards making it mandatory to include clear labels when AI is used in a campaign. And what's particularly interesting is that for this EU election in 2024, parties were the EU parties, so parties who were standing up for a seat at the European Union elections, were asked to sign a declaration saying that any content they use using AI will be clearly labeled as being used with AI. But some parties withdrew from this agreement, and some parties clearly violated it by not using labels when they used AI in their campaigns. And so these are some of the biggest threats that have come out, or concerns, let's say, that have come out as a result of this huge election year that we had last year. And of course, there were also some new discoveries. We saw that there were some very, very realistic deepfakes that were labeled as parody or satire. Now, usually parody or satire is kind of excused as a form of misinformation because the intentionality is usually not to harm people, but to entertain them. But when disinformation is being used in parody or satire and is not labeled as parody or satire, and then it's interpreted as factual, that really does then gray the lines between what is disinformation and misinformation. There was also a very, very interesting kind of opposite of what labeling should do, where sometimes candidates were wrongly accused of being AI generated. So where labeling something as AI generated is very, very important, when you wrongly label something or someone as being AI generated, then you have another problem, right? Where people are again doubting what they're seeing because someone else has accused someone of being AI generated or using AI in their campaign or in their poster or in their video or in terms of the voters that they use in a campaign video. All of these types of accusations get thrown around. And then finally, a very, very concerning and worrying form of AI-generated threat also emerged as a result of this big election year, which was a form of deepfake pornographic smears, where politicians were again targeted here, which can have huge consequences both for their well-being and for their reputation. So to finally, to end by circling back to the beginning of this presentation about this huge amount of attention given to the problem of AI, I think personally, indeed, we didn't really see that AI overtook the elections by misleading voters on a large scale and swinging the results of elections. I don't think we can conclude that from the research and from the analyses that have been done. But I think it's very, very important to look closely at this technology, understand how it can be regulated better and understood better, and how citizens can be empowered and educated to understand when they are coming across this type of content, so that they can make more informed decisions about who to vote for and about how they should be casting their vote, in line with the fact that this technology is emerging and is going to be having a huge influence on their lives, thinking about which politicians are centering AI safety and AI ethics in their manifestos and which politicians are perhaps using AI to mislead voters. So I'll end on that, and I think I will also skip this because I kind of talked about the takeaways. And just to say thank you so much for listening. And if you have any questions or comments, you may get in touch with me via my email, which is on this page. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Axla, for a very interesting presentation, especially for me as I am being from Poland. So I remember how, yes, like a few months ago for EU election and our national election, how much there was talk about like disinformation, false information. So yeah, it was a lot, and it is important topic, of course, but it also brings this feeling of some lack of trust in media, in like government. So that was very interesting what you showed, that there is a lot, but it might be a bit like overemphasized, that maybe we should not panic that much. And it is also very interesting that we can accept like AI generated context if it agree with our beliefs, right? If I think it's like something important and And
exactly. Yeah.
That's very interesting. And I think now we can start a Q&A session. For sure, I have some question, but also, yeah, I can already see people raising hands. So if you have any question, you can use the icon with like raising hand or just put your name, question in the chat. And first, like Maidul Islam, would you like to ask the question? Hello.
Yeah, hello, thank you. I'm from Kolkata in India. I was quite involved with a joint project with Joyce on the chip-based industry. So it seems very interesting from Aksa's presentation that the AI has not been very interventional in the EU elections. Now, it's a kind of course, the research that she is presenting from the current, but a few years back with the Trump's first election in 2016, there were a lot of allegations, at least I don't know the exactness of those allegations, is that the social media and the AI, along with Cambridge Analytica and the Russian, the Russian agencies, they all play an interesting role in the election of Trump. Similarly, in India also, in 2019 parliament elections and also in 2014, this whole entire brand Modi, and there was a proper political consultancy firm called the IPAC, which is headed by Prashant Kishore, and he started his career in 2014, and then he actually gives services to different political parties across ideological lines, from the center left to the right and the far right. So he has actually served the Congress, the BJP, the regional parties like the Trinamool in West Bengal, or the YSR party in Andhra Pradesh, and DMK in Tamil Nadu. So and AAP in Delhi. So he has actually, and his major role is to intervene and to manipulate the AI in the social media. So why is it not happening in EU? So my question is that why is it not happening in EU? Is the institutional surveillance or the government surveillance more strong, or the election commissions there are more vigilant in EU than in US or in India? Thank you.
Should I answer now, or what do you prefer?
Yes, I think we can answer now. If anyone has any more question, they have time.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you so much for your question, Maidul. So just so I understand correctly, are you asking why the threats are more or less prevalent in the EU compared to the US and other parts of the world?
Yeah.
India particularly.
India in particular, yeah.
India and US in particular. So the threats are more, the AI is maybe playing in more in India and US.
Yeah.
While it is less playing in EU. So is it something to do with the institutions or the election commissions, vigilance and surveillance in EU more?
Yeah.
So is the EU election commissions are relatively more autonomous and or more free and democratic and fair than maybe those who are in charge in India?
Yeah, very, very good question. I think a lot of potential reasons. I think the first thing that comes to mind is EU law is very, very strict around these things. So the EU is very famous for the fact that in comparison to the US and other parts of the world, they're very much focused on regulation, especially in the advent of new technologies. So when there is an emergence of a new threat, of a new platform, of a new type of technology, the EU is very focused on trying to make sure that citizens are as safe as possible. And some people argue that this strategy is stifling the EU in terms of innovation. So you could argue that in the US, and in India, there is a lot more innovation on the generative AI front. There's a lot more startups and a lot more coming out in terms of tools and platforms. But in the EU, less so, and that is because there's a lot of stringent regulation around what can and cannot be circulated on platforms in the EU. I think also in the EU there is the polarization that you find in the US, where there is this very, very clear right and left, conservative and democratic split that creates a lot of online discussion and sometimes even overblows people's ability to have civilized discussions. And I think in India, there is a similar level of polarization around certain topics, right? There's the nationalist parties, and then there's the parties who oppose that. And so, again, you probably know more about this than me, because I'm saying this from what I see on the news and what I observe sometimes around me. But it seems like in countries where there is a lot of polarization across certain ideologies or across certain politics, then this type of content flourishes, right? Because it appeals directly to people's ideologies, as we saw in terms of the study that I presented as well. And in the EU, and I'm talking here specifically about countries like the Netherlands and Germany, which I'm closer to in terms of my research, where there is less of that sense of polarization, where people, especially in the EU elections, there's less of a sort of right-left, conservative, democratic battle. There seems to be more of a middle ground. But that is also changing, I think. It's slowly becoming more and more polarized. Also, in the elections here, like for instance, in the Netherlands, you really don't get like two parties to vote from. Absolutely not. You have like almost over 60 parties to vote from in the Netherlands. So you don't really get a two-party system. Similarly, in countries like the UK, it's again going in that direction, but it's very rare that you will only have two parties at every election who will only win everything. But in the US, you find that, and in India, of course, we're kind of seeing that slowly as well. But I think the main issue is that regulation is a lot stricter in the EU. There's a lot more rules around this, and then also polarization and the level to which citizens tend to soak up this type of content. It's very, very different, I think, in Europe.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Do we have any more questions for either Ngani or Dr. Aksa?
I may join in. Maybe afterwards, later on, I would like to hear maybe Langani and Aksa raising questions for each other. But for now, I would like to raise maybe two questions, one for Langani, one for Aksa. The first is concerning, I am familiar with Langani's project very much, and I also hear more today on the layout of this patenting and the effect of this monopolization of this digital technology, and also the digital agency that you are trying to advocate. I mean, the counter action. But first part of my question will be for you would be this similar techniques, okay, Hikvision through this patenting. Have you already observed some social outcome or impact in not only in Johannesburg, but maybe other cities of South Africa, for example, Cape Town, they are maybe the population might be more mixed, or other cities in Southern African countries. In terms of this consequence, or is I mean there's a local hierarchical or exclusive distinction between different maybe ethnic or origin in population. Okay, not just against crime, but against ethnicity and so on. Or as you said, the association between individuals to the event or the space, the site. The Muslims, are they more targeted or not? Okay, in Southern African countries. The second part would be, are there, we actually last time when we talked about Uyghur, and also there's a surveillance system targeting the facial recognition that will spot dissidents or refugees from certain countries. That will be including Rohingya in India, or the Palis in maybe Tibetan in Nepal, or elsewhere, and Uyghur in also European countries or Central Asia. But are there startup or companies that have developed or designed counter surveillance or counter authoritarian control something? Okay, to your knowledge, are there a trend or done by human rights groups in different places? Okay. And my question for Aksa would be, well, the rise of the right wing is so obvious in European countries, right? It's obvious in France and Germany and maybe elsewhere. Okay, if it is not really making an impact, or I really also wonder, as Madhu raised, how come? Okay, like the French election, the almost it's absolutely right, but people coming out to vote against, but with more with economic progress or advancement, will the risk be more serious? And we know that US that was strong. Okay, there's social media, and there's the like social dilemma. The documentary presented the polarization very clearly, but it's not only between the two parties, but it's a lot more complicated. So, but US has a lot of money doing that. India also has developed. I was going also to add the digital surveillance system, or digital Hada card, or digital ID card, and also this the scam activities are also very in a large scale in India. But so if Europe, okay, UN or European countries are picking up with this digital technology, do you think the risk will be real? Yeah, that's it. I seem to be implying that this AI or digital technology first developed, I mean, rapidly in China, by US too, and India too. And Europe seems to be a little bit there's a lack. I don't know. That is a curiosity. Yes.
Okay, so Lungani, do you like to answer first?
Oh, okay. Okay, so I'll go first. So, Professor, the first question was related to like the real socio-political implications of these technologies. And yes, of course, there are already some that are visible. The activist that I spoke to in South Africa, for example, revealed how he was racially profiled, sharing his own personal experience of visiting certain areas where these cameras are installed, and then being approached by private security and being told that he's loitering because of his skin color. So those cameras can pick up that, okay, this person does not live in this area, and therefore they will send private security to come and remove you or to abuse you. And then also, it's not just in terms of racial profiling. For example, in Ukraine, I think last year, a camera was hacked by Russian forces, which was installed in Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine. And then they were able to target specific military targets using those cameras that were hacked. So it's not just the racial profiling, there's also a security issue involved as well. Some of these cameras have backdoors to them. Whether they're deliberate or not, it's still a debatable issue. Some people believe that they're deliberately built to have backdoors so they can send data to servers in China. And then in terms of the resistance that's happening in South Africa, there are some groups that are fighting against these technologies. For example, there's a group called Right to Know. So they're an activist group that are fighting for people to be informed about their data. They want to know who's collecting their data and what's being done to it. And I think one thing that a lot of African countries lack is what Aksa was talking about, the regulation aspect. In Africa, a lot of countries lack proper regulations for these technologies. So we don't have. Maybe on paper we do have our own version of a GDPR, but like it's not really adhered to by local governments, and oftentimes they are courted, as I mentioned, to adopt these technologies. There's no real need for them, but they're often courted to adopt them by these companies who will take them to their headquarters in China, and they will show them how they work and how the benefits that they could bring for their cities. So yeah, so there's definitely resistance, but I think one of the issues that's like perpetuating the adoption of these technologies is the lack of regulation. Yeah.
Gani? Right. Aksa, you could.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor, for your questions. So in terms of the rise of the right and the intersection with this rise and this threat of technology influencing our democracies, what's really, really interesting is that what we saw happening last year and also this year, because this year there was the German election and in February, and what was very, very interesting was that Elon Musk, so we all know now where Elon Musk stands in terms of his political leanings, right? It's very, very clear now. And he represents kind of this new age of technology and technocracy, right? Where we've moved into this age where democracy is no longer about the people who we vote for in our political elections. There's also the people who own the technologies that basically influence our everyday lives. So it's far beyond the AI that we come across right before an election. It's about the social media platforms, the technologies that Lungani was talking about, the algorithms determining what we see and what we don't see, which shape our perceptions of the world and the people around us. The people who own these technologies are people we did not vote for, right? And so there is this huge shift towards a world in which we will be governed by technologies that are owned by people whose sole purpose is more power and more profit. And so if we take Elon Musk as someone who is exemplific of this type of movement that we're going towards, then he's actually tried to, and he is actively trying to play a role in who gets elected, right? He did that in the US. So in the US, he's kind of actually been a bit unsuccessful recently. He tried to influence the Supreme Court ruling in Wisconsin, that failed. And in Germany, he put a lot of support behind the far-right party that I talked about, the AfD. He did a interview with the leader of this party, I think, right before the elections in Germany. And the German elections were called quite spontaneously as well. So there was really, he was very quick to mobilize, let's say. And so there was, so he actively supported this leader of the far-right party. And they didn't succeed as much as people thought they would in the outcome of the German elections, suggesting that his role was perhaps a deterrent for citizens, for voters. They didn't really like the direction that he was going in, especially after the way that he had positioned himself in the US. He's also, so in the UK, we don't really have any major elections coming up anytime soon. We had one last year. But what we're seeing in the UK is that we have this the current party in power is the sort of center-left party, the Labour Party, and the Conservative Party, which would usually be the kind of opposition, is very, very weak at the moment. And so Elon Musk has been putting his support behind the far-right party in the UK, which is called Reform. And you'll be hearing a lot about this party in the next few years, because they are also essentially an alt-right, far-right party whose main mission is about cutting immigration, basically. That's it, right? And so he can get behind this issue, as we've seen before. And he's been supporting them. He's been donating to their political campaigns as well. And this type of support is something that, for instance, the Green Party, or a party that raises alarm bells about the misuse of AI and ethical use of AI, is not getting. They're not getting this type of financial support and this type of attention. And so that kind of balance tipping towards the far right, it is, a huge financial advantage, but whether citizens and voters will, fall for it and feel like, okay, well, this party is clearly aligned with my interests or not, so far it's really hard to say. Because the only example we have really is Germany, and the US, where things have gone in completely opposite directions. So I'm personally, I find this very concerning. I think it goes beyond the problem of AI. It's about technology governance as a whole, and that's where I feel as if we don't have strong regulations and strong transparent processes around who is in control of these platforms and who gets to have access to the data and to be able to dictate a lot of public discourse, as these social media platforms get to do, then we are really moving into a direction where things will get a lot worse. But I really hope that where we can focus our attention on is the citizens and the voters, and empowering them and making sure that they are able to make informed decisions as much as possible. But yeah, very, very important question.
We need to count on citizens' resilience, resistance. But what's happening in the US, it's frightening.
Yeah.
Right, the law can be changed just all of a sudden and changed into an authoritarian regime. So I just hope EU or UK or Europe can hold it. But
Yeah.
I guess Lungani has a question for you.
Okay, yeah. So I found your presentation on misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation informative, especially when you look at the role of generative AI platforms. And so I'm just trying to bring this closer to like my study and like my method. Over the years, I've been using patterns a lot in my studies. For example, there was a study where I looked at Facebook's patterns to see how they are patenting our social relations. You know, they recommend certain stuff to you using the algorithms, and oftentimes they're very clear, you know, how they do this in the patterns. So I was just wondering, like, how do you think, let's say, for example, I was to study like OpenAI or let's see, what are the other OpenAI or Claude AI, because these companies have patents as well. So what kind of questions do you think one could ask in terms of like trying to understand their architectural design? Because that's what patents actually allow us to do. They allow us to understand the ideology of the platform. So what kind of questions do you think a study like that would ask in terms of like, are we asking maybe how the text is generated? How that does your own profile matter in the because you know when you go to YouTube, for example, your profile matter, like the stuff that YouTube recommends is based on your profile. So I just want to know like the kinds of questions that you think the study like that would ask.
Yeah, super amazing question, and I really like the sort of angle that you're coming at this. It's very important. So I think there are some very, I mean, this is such a good question that could lead to someone's future PhD thesis. Honestly, it's so interesting. That I think the starting point is obviously the kind of what kind of information is feeding this type of model, right? That's the first thing, and that links nicely onto your research about biased representations, right? And I think to a certain extent, when you think about the source information that these models are using to generate more new output, because of the information that's out there, there's going to be this inevitability that there's going to be misrepresentations. But that is not being bypassed. There's nothing being done to address that. Those biased representations and the sort of ways in which people have been misrepresented, or people are perhaps ignored. There's a lot of people who will fall between the cracks. There is a lot of information that will not be processed by these tools. That is their worldview that is then used to generate new output. And when I think about like the average citizen who is using these technologies, I want to know what kind of worldview they're obtaining from these technologies based on the limited information that they access. So I think that's how I would approach it if I was to investigate it, is what kind of worldview are these technologies basically now imposing on people? Because like you said, you have like the YouTube algorithms that are based on our interests, and based on the things that we click on the most and we cannot scroll past. But with this type of generative AI technology, it's going to have its own concept of the world based on the information that it was fed, and understanding how that influences its output is really, really important for the user to know. So when I go on a large language model, if I use ChatGPT, I'm using it knowing that it's very limited and that it might produce hallucinations, where it's going to have false information, and I need to verify everything. And it's very good at doing certain things, and it's very bad at doing certain things. And I know its limitations, but the average person might not know that. So how can we make these tools So to the point where when you go on it, you know where its limitations lie and where its strengths lie, because we don't know that. Some people will use these models thinking that they hold accurate information and they hold the answer. So I think that's where maybe I would approach it, is to understand what kind of information it uses, how does it process that to give us the output that we then use for our own uses, let's say. But yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think it's a very good approach. Thank you.
Thank you. We have one more question to ask from Monica. It's in the chat. I will read. So Monica is asking, as you mentioned, the impact of AI-generated disinformation on citizens. I'm curious, have you observed any resistance or resilience emerging among citizens in the EU in response to this issue? Are there any specific initiatives or strategies being implemented to counteract its effect? From Monica.
Yeah, thank you, Monica, for the question. It's a very, very good question. I think there are slowly things emerging. As I mentioned, most of it tends to be happening at the regulation level, at the EU level, but at the kind of bottom-up level, from the citizens level, I would say that it's more kind of like this movement towards, let's say, refusing to use certain platforms over others. So, for instance, if you strongly don't believe in the politics of Elon Musk, you might refrain from using Grok or anything that he produces or anything that he profits from, right? So this kind of, I've noticed a lot, what's been happening is people informing other citizens about the political inclinations of the owner of the platform, and then telling people, well, this one is better or that one is better. But I think it's also very interesting because a lot of AI and a lot of the generative AI platforms rely on using a lot of energy, and this energy is depleting our natural resources. And so if you are someone who cares deeply about the climate and about sustainable technologies and ethical technologies, then you are someone who will probably raise awareness about using these technologies to a lesser extent. And so I've seen a lot of people creating initiatives and bringing attention to the fact that this one image you will create will use up this much water or burn these many trees, and this kind of consciousness has been something I've been noticing a lot, which I think has its place because it is a very important conversation. I think other than that, it's very, very hard to know, because I think the attention given to the problem of AI-generated disinformation has been quite recent, and in relation to citizens themselves responding to it. And I think it's really, really difficult to mobilize against a threat that is so, like, we're so surrounded by it when we go on social media. And then you have things like community notes on certain platforms, which people might rely on and use to inform themselves. But I think these are also very, very limited. So I think more attention needs to be given to this topic by citizens. And I think there need to be more initiatives focusing on citizen awareness and empowering citizens, educating them, because from what I've observed, I don't really see a lot from the citizen side. And I think there could be more. I think there could be more funding towards this. There could be more attention drawn to the campaigns and initiatives that are led by citizens. And I think there's a big space for that. It's something that I find really, really important. But I only seem to see technology companies implementing things like community notes, and then bodies of law, creating bodies like the EU, enforcing regulation, and those things have their place as well. But indeed, at the citizen level, there needs to be more. And I think that requires time, it requires mobilization, it requires setting aside differences and coming together for a common goal, which again, these technologies try to tear down this type of mobilization because they profit off of polarization. So yeah, there's a lot of obstacles, but I think if these types of movements need to happen more. Yeah, thank you so much for your question. I do just have to mention that I have to run for another meeting now. But I'm happy to drop my email in the chat if anyone has any more questions.
Yes, we are running a bit late.
Yeah.
If there are any more questions to Dr. Aksa or Lungan.
Word remark, maybe you cannot really answer it, but considering what's happening in US, the citizenship right by birth has been canceled, or there's a deportation of people who have been maybe adopted, but maybe born and living there for 30 years, and then suddenly they need to be deported to, or maybe another country supposedly the home. But there are many similar things, but similar that is a mentality that's also there in Europe. The border and the resistance to migrant or immigrant and this non-citizens. Okay, or so when you mention the citizens resistance or citizens survey, but those other people's voice are not really there. But the general media, they will feed the citizens maybe more and more toward you might not want to see it, but it might really come up again. Not just right wing, but the protection of your land, protection of your country, your group, and so that might search and through different medias, and then you don't really know whether it's not the environmental issue that's clear ethically that people don't want that, but for the aliens, it seems it's a change of mentality, but that can be done like through school education, but also mass media and AI generated information and so on.
Thank you, Professor. So yeah, I think we should finish. Thank you both presenters for a very interesting and informative presentation about a very important issue that are strictly related to digital technologies, but their implications are way beyond those technologies, and it really has a powerful impact on our life, daily life, political and everything. So thank you again for the presenters, for Professor Liu, for the organizing project, and all the audience for being tonight with us. So thank you and goodbye.